Hey, beloved listener, you can rest now. It's Nick, and we are going through this together. If your mind has been restless all day, if your thoughts have been racing without stopping, or if sleep feels impossible, this moment is for you. Tonight, we will slowly share hours of mysterious stories, each one chosen to quiet the noise and steady your racing thoughts. Gentle rain falling in the background with no interruptions. Just eerie tales read tenderly for you. A couple of ads in the first 10 minutes, then completely ad-free for the rest. Before we begin this journey, let us take a breath together now. The Mustang had been waiting for him in a parking garage on West Adams, 6th level, Bay 34, exactly where the email said it would be. Garrett found it under a canvas tarp that smelled like motor oil and old rain, and when he pulled the fabric back, the car gleamed like something that had never been touched by human hands. It was a 1969 fastback, Acapulco blue with white racing stripes, the paint so flawless it looked wet. The keys were duct taped to the underside of the driver's side mirror with no note, no paperwork, nothing but an address in Scottsdale and a deadline. Deliver by Friday, collect $5,000 cash on arrival. He'd answered the ad on a whim, finding it on Craigslist of all places, buried in the gigs section between someone looking for a hedge trimmer and someone offering to power wash driveways. The ad sought a driver for classic car transport from Chicago to Arizona, requiring a clean record and flexibility, offering generous pay. He'd sent his resume, such as it was, 12 years in logistics coordination for a meatpacking distributor, and gotten a reply within an hour. There was no interview, no phone call, just the garage location, the deadline, and a Venmo deposit for gas money. Rena had been skeptical when he showed her the email. They'd been sitting at the kitchen table, her legal pad covered in columns of figures in her cramped handwriting, the kind of math that made sense to her and no one else. She'd gone quiet, tapping her pencil against the paper with the focused blankness she used when she was thinking about something else entirely. Then she'd set the pencil down and said she wanted to come with him. While he'd been loading their bags into his Honda the next morning, he'd seen her through the bedroom window, standing at the closet with something small in her hands. She'd hesitated, then tucked whatever it was into her overnight bag. He hadn't asked. She had her rituals, her small securities, and he'd learned not to question them. He'd felt a small, bright coin flip in his chest when she said it. They hadn't taken a trip together in 3 years, maybe 4. Not since that long weekend in Wisconsin where it rained the entire time and they'd spent 2 days playing cribbage in a cabin that smelled like mildew. This would be different. Open highway, no agenda, just the two of them in a car that looked like it belonged in a museum. Now, 3 days later, they were somewhere west of Weatherford, Oklahoma, and the highway stretched flat and gray under a sky the color of old cement. Rena had her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass in rhythmic clouds. She'd been asleep for the last hour, or pretending to be. He couldn't always tell the difference. The Mustang purred under him, engine smooth as silk, and he kept the speedometer just under 70 because the car felt like the kind of thing that could get away from you if you let it. They'd stopped twice already, once at a Love's just outside Tulsa, where the coffee tasted like it had been strained through a sock, and once at a Shell station in Stroud where the pump took so long he'd had time to walk around the car twice, checking the tires, running his hand along the hood. The paint had been warm under his palm, heat radiating up from the engine, and he'd thought about the owner, someone rich enough to forget what $5,000 meant, someone who wanted the car driven, not shipped, because they could afford the whim. The first photograph had been tucked under the windshield wiper at the Shell station. He'd seen it when he came back from paying, a white square against the blue paint. And his first thought had been that it was a flyer, some local church group or a missing cat poster. He'd pulled it free and turned it over, The photograph showed Rena asleep in the passenger seat, her head against the window, her mouth slightly open, her hands folded in her lap. The angle was wrong, too close, too intimate. Whoever had taken it had been standing just outside the car, maybe a foot from the glass. On the back, in black marker, someone had written, "I know who you are, and I know what you did." His first reaction had been confusion, the stupid precursor to fear, the brain still looking for reasonable explanations. A prank, teenagers, someone with a Polaroid camera and too much time. But the photograph had been too specific, too recent. Rena's shirt was the same one she'd put on that morning, a faded gray T-shirt with a coffee stain on the hem. The background through the window showed the Shell station's yellow awning, the same awning he was standing under right now. He'd looked around the parking lot. 2 semi-trucks idling near the diesel pumps, a minivan at the far end with a woman loading groceries into the back, but no one watching him, no one with a camera. He'd gotten back in the car and driven. He hadn't shown Rena the photograph then. He'd folded it into his jacket pocket and told himself it was nothing, that he'd figure it out later, that there was probably an explanation that made sense if he just thought about it long enough. But 20 miles down the road, his hands were still tight on the wheel, and he kept checking the rearview mirror for a car that wasn't there. The second photograph had been at the motel in Weatherford. They'd checked in just after sunset, a place called the Trailside Inn that looked like it had been built in the 70s and abandoned sometime in the 90s. The room smelled like disinfectant and old carpet, and the bed sagged in the middle, like something had died there and been imperfectly removed. Rena had dropped her bag on the dresser and gone straight to the bathroom without saying anything. And Garrett had stood in the middle of the room, listening to the water run and feeling the weight of the day settle into his shoulders. He'd gone back out to check the car. Force of habit, maybe, or maybe just an excuse to stand outside for a minute and breathe air that didn't smell like disinfectant and carpet cleaner. The Mustang was parked directly in front of their room, gleaming under the motel's fluorescent lights, and the photograph was tucked under the driver's side wiper. This one showed both of them, sitting in a booth at the diner where they'd stopped for lunch. Rena with a fork halfway to her mouth, Garrett looking down at his phone. The angle was from across the diner through the window, but close enough that he could see the ketchup stain on the napkin next to his plate. Same handwriting on the back. "I know who you are, and I know what you did." His throat had gone dry. He looked up and down the motel parking lot at the scatter of parked cars and the glow of the vending machines and the neon sign that buzzed like something trying to die. No one. Just the hum of the highway in the distance and the faint sound of a television through someone's wall. He'd taken the photograph inside and set it on the dresser next to the first one. Rena came out of the bathroom in her pajamas, her hair wet and combed back from her face, and she'd stopped when she saw them. He showed her both photographs, explained where he'd found them, watched her face go pale and then very still. She'd picked up the diner photo and stared at it for a long time, then set it down carefully, like it might break. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to know who he'd told about the trip. No one, he said, just his brother who hadn't cared. She asked about work. He told her he was on leave. They didn't know where he was. She'd sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the photograph, and he'd watched her try to put the pieces together in a way that made sense. She was good at that, and better than he was. She liked problems that had answers, spreadsheets that balanced, numbers that added up to something you could hold in your hand. This wasn't that kind of problem. She suggested maybe it was about the car. Maybe someone wanted it. He asked why they wouldn't just take it then. She shook her head, said she didn't know. They'd locked the door, checked the window. Rena had wanted to call the police, but what would they say? Someone took our picture and left it on our windshield? It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even technically threatening. just creepy, and the police didn't come for creepy. They'd tried to sleep. Garrett had lain on his back, staring at the ceiling, while Rena curled on her side, facing the wall, and the room had been so quiet he could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, the sound of someone pretending. Around 2 a.m, she'd said his name. He'd turned his head to look at her, but her back was still to him, her shoulders a tense line under the blanket. She asked what if it wasn't about the car, what if it was about her. He'd asked why it would be about her. She hadn't answered. After a long time, he'd heard her breathing slow and deepen, and he'd thought maybe she'd fallen asleep, but he couldn't be sure. Now, in the daylight, with the Oklahoma plains rolling past in shades of brown and gray, he glanced over at her, still asleep or still pretending. Her hands were folded in her lap the same way they'd been in the first photograph. His fingers tightened on the wheel. The third photograph was waiting for them at the gas station in Sayre. He'd pulled off the highway because the Mustang was down to a quarter tank, and the next town was 40 miles out. The station was one of those old-fashioned places with a single pump and a hand-painted sign that said, "Gas Snacks Bait." And the man behind the counter had looked at Garrett like he'd crawled out of a different century. Rena stayed in the car. He'd offered to get her a coffee, but she'd shaken her head and turned her face back to the window. She'd been quiet all morning. The silence had weight, felt like a wall going up between them, and he didn't know how to get through it. The photograph was on the hood when he came back out. This one showed Rena standing outside the motel in Weatherford. She was in her pajamas, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at something off camera. The timestamp on the Polaroid's white border said 2:14 a.m. He picked it up with numb fingers, turned it over. "I know who you are, and I know what you did." The same handwriting, the same message, but this one felt different, more specific, like whoever was taking these pictures wasn't just watching them. They were watching her. He got back in the car and handed her the photograph without saying anything. She looked at it for a long time, then started to cry. It wasn't loud, just tears running down her face while she stared at the picture of herself standing outside the motel in the middle of the night. Garrett's hands went cold on the wheel. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, took a breath that sounded like it hurt. Then she told him her name wasn't Rena, not always. 10 years ago, she'd worked for people in Los Angeles, bad people. She'd kept their books, knew where the money came from and where it went. When the federal prosecutor came knocking, she'd made a deal, testified, watched 3 men go to prison, one of them for life. Then she'd disappeared into witness protection, with a new name and an apartment in Naperville and a job doing taxes for a firm that didn't ask questions. She'd met Garrett 2 years later at a Harris bank where she was closing an account. He'd been standing in line behind her, and when she dropped her checkbook, he'd picked it up and handed it to her with a smile that made her feel like maybe she could be a real person again. They dated for 6 months before he proposed. She'd said yes because she loved him and because she thought maybe the past could stay buried if she just lived carefully enough. But the car, she said, the job, the delivery, the whole thing, it wasn't random. The buyer in Scottsdale was her old boss, the one who'd gone to prison, who'd gotten out 3 years ago on appeal. The car had a tracker in it somewhere, she was sure of it. He was using Garrett to draw her out, to get her away from Naperville, where she had routines and neighbors and a life that made sense. Out here on the highway, she was exposed, vulnerable, and the photographs were proof that he'd been following them since Chicago, watching them sleep and eat and drive, waiting for the right moment. She said she was sorry, said she should have told him years ago, but she'd been afraid he'd leave and she couldn't lose him. Not when he was the only good thing she'd built since everything fell apart. Garrett sat very still with his hands on the wheel. The engine was running, but he hadn't put the car in drive yet. He could see her reflection in the windshield, her face pale and wet. And he thought about all the small moments over 8 years that suddenly looked different now. The way she never wanted her picture taken, the way she startled when the phone rang, the way she checked the locks twice every night before bed. He reached over and took her hand, told her it was okay, that they'd figure it out, that he wasn't going anywhere. Her fingers tightened around his and she nodded, not looking at him. In the middle of pretending to love her, he'd started to forget which parts were real and which parts were performance. And he felt the weight of the lie settle into his bones like something that had always been there. He pulled the Mustang back onto the highway and drove. The Texas panhandle opened up around them like a wound, all red dirt and scrub grass and sky that went on forever. They drove through towns that barely qualified as towns, just a gas station and a church and maybe a Dollar General if you were lucky. The billboards advertised injury lawyers and adult superstores and something called Cadillac Ranch that Garrett had heard about once, but couldn't remember why. Raina had stopped crying. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the window. And every so often, Garrett would glance over and see her reflection staring back at him, blank and far away. He wanted to say something, wanted to ask her questions that he'd never thought to ask before. What her real name was, what she'd been like before she disappeared, whether she'd ever actually loved him or if he'd just been part of the cover. But the words stuck in his throat like stones. He'd known since the beginning. That was the thing she didn't understand. The thing he'd spent 8 years making sure she never found out. He'd known who she was the day he met her at the Harris Bank, had recognized her from the newspaper photos that ran during the trial, the cartel bookkeeper who turned state's witness. She'd looked different in the photos. Longer hair, darker lipstick. The hard, polished look of someone who worked in rooms where people made decisions that ruined lives, but the eyes were the same. Sharp and careful, and always calculating the angles. His brother's eyes had been different. The kid had been sloppy, all impulse and ego. He'd bragged to bartenders, promised protection to waitresses, trust the wrong people, because he thought loyalty meant something when the walls started closing in. He'd gone to prison because of Rana's testimony, 15 years in Stateville, and he'd lasted 18 months before someone shivved him in the shower over a card game debt that everyone knew wasn't actually about cards. Garrett had been 24 when his brother died. He'd cried at the funeral and thrown dirt on the casket, and gone home to the apartment they'd shared and realized he didn't know what to do with the rest of his life. His brother had been the one with plans, with connections, with the charm that made people want to help him even when they knew better. Garrett had just been the younger brother who did what he was told and kept his head down and never asked too many questions. But grief had a way of sharpening things, making you see patterns you'd missed before. And after a while, Garrett started thinking about the woman who'd put his brother in prison, wondering where she'd gone, whether she was sleeping well at night, whether she ever thought about the people whose lives she'd dismantled with her spreadsheets and her testimony. He'd found her by accident, a slip in the witness protection system, a clerk who'd left a file unsecured, a name that matched an address in Naperville. He'd driven out there on a Saturday with no plan except to see her, to confirm she was real and not just a ghost he'd invented to have someone to blame. She'd been closing her bank account. He'd stood behind her in line and watched her hands shake as she signed the withdrawal slip, and he'd thought, she's afraid. Good. She should be. But when she dropped her checkbook and he'd picked it up and handed it to her, she'd smiled at him. A real smile, nervous and grateful. The kind that made her look younger and more fragile than she had any right to be. And something had shifted in his chest, something cold and patient that said, This could work. The courtship had been easy. She was lonely, desperate for connection, and he was good at being exactly what people needed. Steady, reliable, kind. He'd proposed after 6 months because that felt like the right timeline, and she'd cried when she said yes, and he'd held her and told her he'd never leave her, and meant every word in a way she'd never understand. 8 years. 8 years of marriage, of shared meal and shared bills and a mortgage on a house in a subdivision where everyone's lawn looked the same. 8 years of watching her relax by degrees, of seeing the fear fade from her eyes, of becoming the person she trusted most in the world. 8 years of waiting for the right moment. The moment had come 3 months ago when he'd seen the ad on Craigslist. Someone was looking for a driver to transport a classic car from Chicago to Arizona. The pay was too good, the job too convenient. And when he'd sent his resume, he'd included a note at the bottom. "I can bring my wife. She'd love the trip." The reply had come within an hour. That would be perfect. He'd known it was a setup, known that whoever placed the ad wanted Rena specifically, wanted her out of Naperville and onto the open highway where she'd be exposed and vulnerable. And he'd taken the job anyway because it was exactly what he'd been waiting for. A way to deliver her to the people who wanted her dead without any of it tracing back to him. But he'd needed her afraid first. Needed her to understand that the past had caught up with her, that there was no running this time, that the life she'd built was as fragile as she'd always suspected. So he'd bought a Polaroid camera at a Walgreens in Joliet and waited until she fell asleep at the first gas station. The photograph had been easy. Just crouch by the passenger window, frame the shot, press the button. The hardest part had been writing the message on the back without his hand shaking. The second photo at the diner had required more planning. He'd excused himself to the bathroom, walked out the back exit, circled around to the front window, and taken the shot through the glass while she ate her burger and scrolled through her phone. The third had been luck and patience. He'd gone out to move the car closer to their room and seen her silhouette through the motel window, pacing, restless. He'd waited by the ice machine with the camera ready, and when she'd finally come outside in her pajamas to check the parking lot, he'd been there in the shadows, watching her stare at the Mustang like it might tell her something she needed to know. Each photograph had done exactly what he'd needed it to do, broken her down, made her desperate enough to confess. And now here they were, driving deeper into nowhere, and she thought he was on her side. The GPS showed another 160 miles to the Arizona border. After that, it was just open desert and empty highway, and a meeting in Scottsdale that would never happen. He'd planned the route carefully, memorized the side roads and the abandoned stretches where you could drive for an hour without seeing another car. There was a canyon about 40 miles south of the interstate, just a crack in the earth where the rocks went down, and no one ever looked. He'd pull off there, tell her he wanted to show her something. And when they were far enough from the road that screaming wouldn't matter, he'd stop the car and tell her the truth, that he'd known since the beginning, that his brother had been everything to him, that every moment of their marriage had been a performance, a long, patient con, designed to make her feel safe right up until the moment he took it all away. He wanted her to know. That was the important part. He didn't just want her dead. Plenty of people wanted her dead, and they'd had 8 years to make it happen. He wanted her to understand that the thing she'd feared most, the cartel boss tracking her across state lines, wasn't the real threat. The real threat had been sleeping next to her every night, holding her when she cried, promising her that everything would be okay. The real threat had been him. A sign flashed past. Adrian, 12 miles. Rena shifted in her seat, and he glanced over to see her staring at him. Not at the window, not at the road, but at him. Her face was different, calmer, like she'd made a decision. She asked if they could pull over, said she needed to stretch her legs, clear her head, maybe walk around for a minute. Her voice was steady now, no tears, just the flat, practical tone she used when she was working through a problem. He nodded, told her there was a rest stop coming up. They could stop there. She shook her head, said she didn't want a rest stop, too many people. She wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere they could talk without anyone else around. His hands tightened on the wheel. His pulse slowed, the way it always got when something was about to happen. He told her okay, that he knew a place. He took the next exit, a 2-lane farm road that cut south through fields of nothing, and after a mile the pavement turned to gravel and the gravel turned to dirt. The canyon wasn't far now, just another few miles and they'd be there, and he could finish what he'd started 8 years ago. Raina was watching him. He could feel it without looking, the weight of her attention like something physical. She said his name. He didn't answer. She said it again, and this time there was something in her voice that made him look over. She was holding a gun, small revolver, snub-nosed, the kind you could hide in a purse or a glove compartment. But she wasn't pointing it at him. She was holding it flat on her palm, offering it. She told him to stop the car. He stopped the car. She held the gun out toward him, told him to take it. He stared at her, at the gun, at her face, which was calm in a way that felt worse than fear. She said she'd carried it for 8 years and never loaded it, that she'd promised herself she was done with that life. But she'd needed him to see it, needed him to understand that she could have defended herself any time in the last 3 days and chose not to, that she'd let him take the photographs, let him drive her into the desert, let him bring her to this exact place because she'd known what he was planning since the first photo appeared. She told him to take the gun and decide. He got out of the car without taking it. The desert stretched around them in every direction, empty and silent except for the wind moving through the scrub. The Mustang sat ticking in the heat, paint gleaming. Raina came around from the passenger side, the gun still in her hand, still not pointed at him. She asked how long he'd known. He didn't see the point in lying anymore. Told her since the beginning, since the bank, since before they'd even spoken. She nodded like she'd expected that. Asked if the photographs were his, he said yes. Asked if there was really a buyer in Scottsdale. He said no. She stood there for a long moment, and he waited for her to cry or scream or ask him why, but she didn't do any of those things. She just looked tired. She told him his brother had been sloppy, that he'd skimmed money from the wrong people and bragged about it to the wrong women and made himself a liability long before the feds came knocking, that she'd tried to warn him, told him to get out while he still could, but he'd laughed at her, called her paranoid, said family took care of family. She set the gun on the Mustang's hood. She asked if Garrett knew what his brother had done with the money he'd skimmed. If he knew about the apartment in Schaumburg where the girl had been stashed, the 19-year-old hostess from a restaurant, and the baby she'd had 6 months before he went to prison. Garrett felt something cold spread through his chest. He hadn't known. His brother had never mentioned a girlfriend, never mentioned a child. Raina said the girl's name had been something soft and forgettable, that she'd been a hostess at a restaurant where his brother liked to eat, and that he'd gotten her pregnant and promised to take care of her, and then disappeared into Stateville. That Raina had found out about the baby through the same cartel channels that found out about everything, and that she'd sent money every month for 3 years after he died because it was the right thing to do, and because the baby hadn't asked to be born into any of this. She asked if he'd ever wondered where her money went. The accountant's salary that should have left more in their savings account than it did. Garrett didn't answer. Raina picked the gun back up, opened the cylinder, showed him the empty chambers. Then she dropped it in the dirt at his feet. She told him she'd known he was his brother's family since their second date, that she'd done her own research, run her own background checks, and when the pieces had come together, she'd made a choice. She could run again, disappear into another city with another name, or she could stay. See if maybe Garrett was different from his brother. See if maybe 8 years of pretending could turn into something real. Or if maybe she'd just been waiting all along for someone to finally make her pay. She didn't know which one she'd been hoping for. She said she'd been wrong about that. She asked if he was going to kill her. He looked down at the gun in the dirt between them. It felt like a test he didn't know how to pass. He'd spent 8 years planning this, 8 years building toward the moment when he'd watch her realize that the person she trusted most had been her enemy all along. But standing here in the desert with the sun beating down and her face so tired and resigned, and the empty gun between them like evidence of something he couldn't name, he couldn't remember why it had mattered. His brother was dead. The money was gone. The life they'd built together was a fiction neither of them believed in anymore. He left the gun where it lay. Told her to get back in the car. She didn't move. He said it again, and this time she walked back to the passenger side and got in. He got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled back onto the dirt road heading north toward the highway. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. Then Rena reached over and turned on the radio, and some country station came through the static, and they listened to a song about a man leaving his woman for a woman who'd left another man, and when it was over, neither of them said anything. Garrett kept driving. They stopped at a motel outside Amarillo as the sun was setting. The place was called the Desert Star, and it looked like every other motel they'd stayed at, shabby and anonymous and cheap. Garrett checked them in while Rena waited in the car, and when he came back out with the key, she followed him to the room in silence. The room smelled like bleach and old smoke. Rena sat on the edge of the bed, and Garrett stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot where the Mustang gleamed under the security lights. He told her they should call it off, the trip, the delivery, all of it. They could drive back to Chicago tonight, be home by tomorrow afternoon. Pretend none of this had ever happened. Rena shook her head, said they were already here, that whatever they were going to do or say or be to each other, they needed to finish it first. She asked if he still wanted to kill her. He didn't answer. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, and after a moment, he heard her breathing even out into something that might have been sleep. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot. A semi pulled in around midnight, idled for 20 minutes, then pulled out again. A couple in their 20s checked into the room next door and turned on a television that played canned laughter through the wall until 3 in the morning. Somewhere a dog barked, over and over, the same hoarse rhythm, until it stopped. When the sun came up, Rena was already awake, sitting on the bed with her shoes on, waiting. They got back in the Mustang and drove. The Arizona border came and went. The landscape shifted from red dirt to something paler and emptier, all white sand and distant mountains that looked like they'd been drawn in pencil. The highway stretched straight and perfect, and Garrett kept his eyes on the yellow line and tried not to think about what came next. Rena broke the silence around noon. She asked what he was going to tell people when he got back to Chicago. He said he didn't know, that she disappeared maybe, that the cartel finally found her, that he'd come home from the gas station, and she was gone. She nodded, said that would work, that it was close enough to the truth that people would believe it. She asked if he'd thought about the Mustang, what he'd do with it after. He hadn't. The car had been part of the plan. Proof that he'd completed the delivery, that everything had gone according to the buyer's instructions. But there was no buyer. Just a fake email address and a meet location that didn't exist. Rena said they should sell it. That a car like this was worth real money, maybe 60 or 70,000 if they found the right collector. That they could split the cash and use it however they wanted. A down payment on a fresh start, or a nest egg for the child's trust fund, or just something to hold on to in case the next 8 years went differently than the last 8. He looked at her, at the woman who'd been his enemy, and his wife, and now something he didn't have a word for. He asked what she wanted. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she wanted to meet the girl, wanted to tell her about his brother. Not the whole truth, not the parts that would scare her, but enough that she'd know her father had been real and flawed and human, that he'd made mistakes, but he'd also left behind something good. She said she wanted Garrett to come with her when she did it, that the child should meet her uncle, that maybe they could all 3 of them have dinner somewhere normal, like Applebee's or Olive Garden, and talk about school and soccer and things that didn't matter in the way that mattering used to mean life or death. She asked if that was something he could imagine. He thought about it, about sitting across the table from a 10-year-old girl who had his brother's smile, about Raina trying to explain who they were and why it mattered, about the weight of the last 8 years and whether it was possible to set it down and walk away. He told her maybe. She smiled. It was a small, sad thing, but real. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The address in Scottsdale turned out to be a vacant lot behind a strip mall. No buyer, no cash. Just an empty stretch of asphalt baking in the sun, and a chain-link fence with a sign that said, "No trespassing." Garrett put the Mustang in park, and they sat there for a while, engine running, air conditioning blasting cold air that smelled like leather and gasoline. Raina said they should go home. He nodded. She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cool and dry, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time they'd touched each other on purpose, and not as part of the performance, but because they wanted to. He squeezed her hand once, then let go, put the car in reverse, turned around, drove. They stopped for gas in Flagstaff. While Rena was in the bathroom, Garrett walked around to the passenger side of the Mustang and checked under the wheel well, running his fingers along the metal until he found what he was looking for. A small black box about the size of a matchbook, held in place with a magnet. GPS tracker. Live signal. He pulled it free and walked over to a semi-truck idling at the diesel pump. Stuck the tracker to the underside of the truck's trailer, right behind the rear axle where no one would think to look. Let whoever was tracking them follow the truck to Seattle or Sacramento or wherever it was going. Let them wonder. When Rena came back, he was leaning against the Mustang with his hands in his pockets, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. She asked if he was okay. He said yeah, that he was fine. They got back in the car and merged onto I-40 heading east, and the highway opened up in front of them like something clean and new, and for a while it felt like maybe they could drive forever and never have to arrive anywhere that mattered. Somewhere outside Albuquerque, Rena fell asleep with her head against the window. Garrett glanced over at her, at the way the fading light turned her face soft and unguarded, and he thought about the photographs he'd taken. The ones tucked in his jacket pocket, still there, still waiting. I know who you are, and I know what you did. He thought about pulling over, taking one more photograph, writing something different on the back, something true. But he didn't. He kept driving, and the desert rolled past, and somewhere behind them, the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the road ahead turned dark except for the Mustang's headlights cutting through the night. Rena's hand twitched in her sleep. Her fingers curled around nothing, then relaxed. Garrett reached over and covered her hand with his. She didn't wake up. He kept driving. The highway stretched east through the dark, endless and empty, and they followed it home. They crossed back into Oklahoma just after midnight. Rena woke up somewhere around the Texas border, disoriented, asking where they were. Garrett told her. She nodded and went back to sleep. He'd been driving for 16 hours with only brief stops for gas and bathroom, and his body had gone past tired into numb autopilot. His hands moved on the wheel, but his mind drifted. He kept thinking about the tracker, about whoever had placed the ad, whoever had set up the fake delivery, whoever had been expecting Rena to arrive in Scottsdale and not leave. The cartel, probably. Had to be. Rena's testimony had put people in prison, and prison didn't make people forget. But there was something about the whole setup that didn't fit. The ad had been too public, too easy to trace. If the cartel wanted Rena dead, they had better ways than luring her across 4 states in a vintage Mustang. Cleaner ways. Professional ways. Unless it wasn't about killing her at all. The thought came to him slowly, assembling itself from pieces he'd been too focused on his own plan to notice. The photographs. The message. I know who you are, and I know what you did. He'd written those words himself, but what if someone else had been planning to write them too? What if the whole point of the delivery had been to terrorize Rena, to make her panic, to force her into doing something stupid, like running or confessing or leading them to something? He looked over at Rena, still asleep. Thought about the bank statement she'd shown him. $240,000 in an account under her name. His brother's money, she'd said. The money she'd found in a storage unit and used to take care of the child. But what if there was more? What if the cartel thought she'd taken more than she had, and they'd spent 10 years trying to find it? What if the delivery wasn't about killing her? It was about watching her, following her, seeing where she went and who she talked to and whether she'd lead them to a stash they thought she'd hidden. His hands tightened on the wheel. The tracker hadn't been on the Mustang when he'd picked it up in Chicago. He'd checked the whole car before leaving, looking for anything that might be a problem, which meant someone had planted it later. At one of the gas stations, maybe, or the motel in Weatherford. Someone close enough to touch the car while they slept. Someone who'd been following them the whole time. He checked the rearview mirror. The highway behind them was empty, just darkness, and the occasional glow of distant headlights. But that didn't mean anything. Professional surveillance wouldn't be obvious. They'd hang back, use multiple vehicles, rotate positions. You'd never see them unless they wanted you to. Rena stirred in her seat, opened her eyes and looked at him, asked what was wrong. He told her he thought they were still being followed. She sat up straight, suddenly awake. Asked how he knew. He explained about the tracker, about pulling it off the Mustang and sticking it to the semi-truck, about the timing, how it hadn't been on the car in Chicago, which meant someone had put it on later, which meant someone had been close enough to touch the car while they weren't looking. Rena went very still. Then she asked if he'd checked the car for anything else. He said no, that he'd been focused on the tracker. She told him to pull over. He found an exit for a town called Eric, took it and drove until they found a gas station that was closed for the night, just a dark building with a single security light over the pumps. He parked the Mustang under the light, and they both got out. Rena opened the trunk. Nothing inside but the spare tire and a jack. She pulled up the carpet, checked underneath. Empty. Garrett checked the wheel wells, the undercarriage, the door panels, all clean. Rena opened the glove compartment. Registration, insurance card, owner's manual. She flipped through the manual page by page, shook it. Nothing fell out. She sat back in the passenger seat and closed her eyes. He asked what she was thinking. She said the tracker was a message. Whoever planted it knew he'd find it eventually, knew that finding it would make him paranoid, make him start looking for other things, make him wonder who was watching and why. She said it was a power play, a way of saying, we know where you are, we've always known, and there's nothing you can do about it. Garrett leaned against the car. The night was cool, finally, after the brutal heat of the day. He could smell sage and dust and something else, something sharp and acrid that might have been fertilizer from the field stretching out in all directions. He asked if she was scared. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. Said she'd been scared for 10 years. That fear was just part of her routine now, like brushing her teeth or checking the locks. She asked if he was going to leave her. The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since they'd gotten married. She was 41 years old, tired, carrying weight that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the choices she'd made and the people she'd hurt and the life she'd tried to build on top of all that damage. She was a stranger. She'd always been a stranger. But so was he. He told her no, that he wasn't leaving. She nodded, didn't ask why. Maybe she already knew. Maybe it didn't matter. They got back in the Mustang and drove. Dawn came up over the Oklahoma plains like something reluctant, all gray and pale. They stopped for coffee at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City and sat in the car drinking it without talking. The coffee tasted like dirt, but it was hot, and that was enough. Rena asked what they were going to do when they got back to Chicago. Garrett said he didn't know. Go back to work, probably. Go back to the house. Go back to the life they'd been living. She asked if that was enough. He thought about it, about the mortgage and the subdivision and the lawn that looked like everyone else's lawn, about 8 years of pretending that had turned into something that wasn't quite pretending anymore, but wasn't quite real either. He said maybe it could be. She finished her coffee and crumpled the cup. Said she wanted to be different. Not a different person. She'd tried that already, and it hadn't worked. Just different than she'd been. More honest, maybe. Less afraid. She said she wanted to tell him things she'd never told anyone. About the people she'd worked for, and the things she'd seen, and the moment she'd decided to testify, even though she knew it might kill her. She wanted him to know who she'd been before she became Rena. And she wanted to know who he'd been before he became the person who married her for revenge. She asked if that was something he wanted too. He looked out at the parking lot, at the trucks and the cars and the people moving between them, like pieces in a game whose rules he'd never quite understood. He said yeah, that he did. They finished their coffee and got back on the highway. The miles ticked past. Illinois came up on the horizon, flat and green and familiar. They crossed the state line around noon. Garrett hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until the welcome sign passed and his lungs finally expanded. Rena turned on the radio. Found a station playing oldies. The Doors came on, Riders on the Storm, and they listened without speaking while the highway rolled past. When the song ended, Rena reached over and turned the volume down. She said there was one more thing she needed to tell him. His hands tightened on the wheel. She said she'd made up the story about being followed. That she'd convinced herself it had to be the cartel because that was easier than facing the truth. That maybe Garrett had figured out who she was, and maybe he'd spent their entire marriage planning this. She said she'd known about his brother since before they met. That she'd seen Garrett at the funeral, standing at the back in a black suit that didn't fit right. And she'd recognized him from photographs the kid had kept in his apartment. That when Garrett had shown up at the bank 2 years later, she'd known immediately what it meant. She said she could have run, should have run, but she'd been tired of running, and the rest, the hope, the guilt, the confusion, she'd already told him back in the desert. She said maybe they'd both been wrong about what they thought they wanted. Garrett drove in silence. Naperville came up on the signs. Exit 271. Their exit. Home. He took it. The subdivision looked exactly the way they'd left it. Same lawn, same driveways, same sense that nothing ever really changed here. That time just circled and circled without going anywhere. He pulled the Mustang into their driveway and killed the engine. They sat there for a long time, neither of them moving to get out. Finally, Rena reached over and took his hand. She asked if he still had the photographs. He said yes. She asked if he'd keep them. He thought about it. About the images of her sleeping, eating, standing in the dark outside the motel. About the message on the back. I know who you are, and I know what you did. He said no, that he'd burn them. She squeezed his hand and let go. They got out of the car. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower started up, and Garrett could smell cut grass and gasoline and the particular scent of summer in the suburbs that always made him think of things being the same forever. Rena went inside. He stayed in the driveway looking at the Mustang. It really was a beautiful car. The kind of thing that should have belonged to someone who appreciated it, someone who knew what they had. He thought about what Rena had said, about selling it, splitting the money, using it for the child's trust fund or a fresh start, or just something to hold on to. He thought about all the things the car represented, the trap that wasn't a trap, the revenge that wasn't revenge, the 8 years of marriage that had been real and fake at the same time. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the 3 Polaroids he'd taken. Rena asleep at the gas station, both of them at the diner, her standing in the motel parking lot at 2:14, the ones with his handwriting on the back. I know who you are, and I know what you did. He looked at them for a long time. Then he put them back in his pocket and went inside. Puckett was 61 years old and $4,300 behind on his mortgage when Landry called and offered him the Frightener job. This was late December 2019, 2 days after Christmas, and Puckett had spent the holiday alone in his rented efficiency above the shuttered hardware store in Welch, eating canned chili and watching the snow pile up on the empty storefronts across the street. The building still had heat, but the landlord kept it low to save money, so Puckett wore his coat indoors and slept under 2 blankets and an old sleeping bag he'd bought at Goodwill 3 years ago. The sleeping bag smelled like mildew and someone else's sweat, but it was warm enough. He'd been a sheriff's deputy for 18 years in McDowell County before they found out about the cash he'd been skimming from evidence lockup. It wasn't much. 100 here, a couple hundred there. Always from drug seizures, where the bills were loose and uncounted, where nobody tracked things too close. 15,000, give or take. He'd stopped counting after the first year. When Internal Affairs finally caught him, they gave him the choice: resign quiet or face charges. He took the resignation. That was 4 years ago. Since then, he'd worked security at the Walmart in Bluefield until they caught him sleeping on shift. And before that, he'd driven a bread truck until the company folded. Now he did odd jobs for Landry, who owned half the dying real estate in southern West Virginia, and needed men willing to work cheap and keep their mouths shut. The phone call came at 9 in the morning. Puckett was eating instant oatmeal at the card table he used for a kitchen when his cell phone buzzed. Landry didn't bother with pleasantries. The job was simple, Landry said. There was a condemned building on Virginia Avenue, the old Elkhorn Hotel, scheduled for demolition on January 2nd. But squatters kept breaking in, setting up camp in the empty apartments. Every time the police cleared the building, new ones showed up. Landry needed them gone for good before the bulldozers arrived. That's where Puckett came in. Make the building too scary to stay in. Stage some hauntings. Loud noises in the middle of the night, doors slamming, shadows moving behind walls, voices calling out names. The kind of thing that made desperate people decide the cold streets were safer than whatever was inside. $800 cash if the building was empty by New Year's Day. Puckett said yes before Landry finished talking. He needed the money more than he needed dignity, and dignity didn't keep the heat on anyway. He spent the afternoon at Walmart buying supplies. A battery-powered megaphone, $40 on clearance. A portable Bluetooth speaker, $23. Fresh batteries, zip ties, work gloves. He already had most of the tools he needed. Crowbar, hammer, flashlight. And he had the Glock 19 he'd bought off a guy in Princeton 3 years ago. He'd test-fired it once in a gravel pit and never cleaned it. The slide was stiff and the trigger pull was heavy, but it worked. Landry had warned him some of the squatters were unpredictable. Tweakers, mostly. Puckett had dealt with tweakers before, back when he was a deputy. They didn't scare him then, and they didn't scare him now. He loaded his phone with sound files he found online. Chains dragging across concrete, children crying, footsteps pacing back and forth, women screaming. The recordings were low quality, compressed and tinny, but they'd sound real enough in the dark. The Elkhorn Hotel stood 4 stories tall at the dead end of Virginia Avenue, a brick tenement built in 1923 for coal miners and their families. Back then, Welch had been a railroad hub, 20,000 people, money flowing through from the mines. Now it was down to maybe 2,000, and most of those were too old or too poor to leave. The Elkhorn had been condemned in 2015 after the pipes froze and burst, flooding the second floor and collapsing part of the ceiling. The county had ordered it demolished, but demolition cost money the town didn't have, so it just sat there like a rotten tooth. Windows broken, bricks streaked black with water damage and soot. Puckett drove out there late on a Wednesday night, close to midnight. The snow had stopped, but the temperature was dropping, somewhere around 15 degrees. His truck, a rusted-out Dodge Dakota with 200,000 miles on it, rattles up Virginia Avenue past boarded windows and empty lots where houses used to be. The streetlights were out. The only light came from his headlights, cutting through the dark and the faint glow of a meth house 2 blocks over. Blue light flickering in the windows like a television, left on all night. He parked across the street from the Elkhorn and sat there for a while, engine running, heat blowing, looking at the building. It was worse than he remembered. The bricks were streaked black with soot and water damage. Most of the windows on the first floor were boarded up, but the upper floors still had glass, jagged and broken, reflecting the moonlight. The front entrance was a double door set back in a shallow alcove, the wood warped and split. Someone had spray-painted "Eat the Poor" across the second-story brickwork, in white letters 3 feet tall. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but it had been cut open in a dozen places. Snowdrifts piled against the foundation, and icicles hung from the gutters like teeth. Puckett killed the engine and grabbed the duffel bag from the passenger seat. Inside, the megaphone, the speaker, the flashlight, the crowbar, the hammer, the zip ties, and the Glock. He wasn't expecting trouble, but $800 was $800, and he'd learned a long time ago that desperation made people dangerous. He pulled on his work gloves and a black knit cap and stepped out into the cold. His breath steamed. The snow crunched under his boots. He crossed the street and ducked through one of the cuts in the fence, slinging the duffel over his shoulder. The front doors were chained shut from the outside, but he'd been in the building before during a welfare check 2 years ago when he was still a deputy. He knew the back entrance by the loading dock was easier. He walked around the side of the building, past a dumpster overflowing with frozen trash bags and a pile of old mattresses someone had dragged out and left to rot. The mattresses were covered in snow now, their striped ticking visible in patches, stained dark with things Puckett didn't want to think about. The loading dock was a concrete platform about waist high. The metal roll-up door rusted shut, but there was a regular door next to it with the lock broken. Someone had jimmied it open with a crowbar months ago, judging by the rust on the exposed metal. Puckett climbed up onto the platform and pushed the door open. It scraped against the concrete floor inside, the sound echoing through the empty building. He switched on the flashlight and stepped through. The smell hit him first. Piss. Mildew. Something sharper underneath. Industrial, rotten, old ammonia from meth cooking, or just the accumulated stink of people living without plumbing. The loading dock opened into a maintenance corridor that ran the length of the ground floor. Bare cinder block walls, cracked concrete floor. Water had pooled in the low spots and frozen solid, patches of ice gleaming in the flashlight beam. His breath clouded in front of him. Colder inside than outside, the building like a refrigerator with the door left open. The corridor was littered with trash. Old paint cans, their labels peeling and faded. A shopping cart on its side, one wheel missing. Bundled clothes that might have been a person at first glance, but were just rags frozen stiff. A sleeping bag crusted with filth, the fabric so stiff it stood up on its own like a cocoon. Someone had been sleeping here recently, but they were gone now. Puckett walked slow, keeping the light low, listening. The building was quiet, but not empty quiet. Somewhere above him, something creaked. Wind, maybe, or weight shifting on old floorboards, or something else. He reached the main hallway that ran from the back entrance to the front lobby. The ceiling here was higher, the walls plaster and horsehair, cracked and peeling. In some places the plaster had fallen away entirely, exposing the wooden lath underneath like ribs. Doorways opened off both sides into what used to be ground floor apartments, most of them stripped bare. He checked each one as he passed. Empty rooms with broken fixtures, graffiti on the walls layered so thick you couldn't read the individual messages anymore. Burn marks where squatters had tried to make fires in the corners. One room had a dead pigeon frozen on the windowsill, its feathers roughed up, eyes filmed over with ice. Another had a pile of syringes in the corner, orange caps scattered across the floor like confetti. The needles all pointed in the same direction, like iron filings around a magnet. No people. Not yet. The stairwell was at the far end of the hall, near the front entrance. Puckett stood at the base of the stairs and shone the flashlight up. The steps were wood, sagging in the middle from decades of use. Some of them cracked straight through. The handrail had been torn off years ago, probably sold for scrap metal. He could see 2 flights up before the stairwell turned and disappeared into darkness. The walls here were covered in graffiti. Names, dates, crude drawings of dicks and skulls, declarations of love and hate spray-painted over each other in layers so thick the wall looked textured. Someone had written, "Help me in what looked like blood," but it was probably just rust from the pipes. He started climbing, one hand on the wall for balance, the other holding the flashlight. The stairs groaned under his weight, the sound echoing up the shaft. On the second step, his boot punched through a rotten board, and he had to catch himself against the wall to keep from falling through. Splinters dug into his palm, even through the glove. He pulled his foot free and tested each step after that before putting his weight down, moving slow, listening to the way the building responded to his presence. The second floor smelled worse than the first. The burst pipes had left black mold blooming across the ceiling and walls in wide, sprawling patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had painted them there on purpose. Fractals of decay. The plaster had fallen away in chunks, exposing the wooden lath underneath, and in some places the lath had rotted through too, leaving holes where you could see straight into the apartments beyond, or down into the apartments below, like looking through layers of rotten tissue. Some of the floorboards were soft and spongy underfoot, the wood saturated with years of water damage. Puckett kept close to the walls where the joists were, moving slow, testing the floor before each step, listening to the way it complained under him. He checked each apartment as he went. More empty rooms, more trash, more evidence of people trying to survive in a place that was trying to kill them. One room had a camping stove set up on the floor, the kind that ran on propane canisters. But the canister was empty and the stove was tipped over. The rubber hose connecting them had rotted through, split open like dead skin. Another had blankets piled in the corner, arranged into a kind of nest. But the blankets were frozen stiff, and whoever had been sleeping there was gone. The blankets were arranged in a very specific way, though, folded and layered with care, like someone had been trying to build something that felt like home. He was starting to think maybe Landry's information was wrong, that the building really was empty. When he reached the third floor and heard breathing, it was coming from one of the apartments near the middle of the hall, the door hanging crooked on one hinge. Puckett stopped outside and listened. Slow, wet breathing, nasal congestion. The sound of someone deep asleep or passed out. He unzipped the duffel and pulled out the megaphone, flipped it on, held it up to his mouth. He pressed the trigger and let out a low moan, distorted and electronic, echoing through the empty hallways. The breathing stopped. Puckett moaned again, longer this time, then added a rattling sound by tapping the megaphone with his knuckles. The sound bounced off the walls, multiplied, came back at him from different directions. He heard movement inside the apartment. Someone scrambling to their feet, stumbling, knocking something over, metal clattering on the floor, a voice muffled, saying something that might have been a prayer or a curse. A man appeared in the doorway, maybe 40 years old, gaunt, wearing a stained hoodie and jeans with holes in the knees. His face was shadowed, but Puckett could see his eyes were wide, pupils dilated, tweaker eyes. The man swayed slightly, like he was trying to remember how to stand, like gravity was a concept he'd forgotten. Puckett hit the megaphone trigger again and hissed into it. The sound amplified into something inhuman and wrong, something that shouldn't exist. The man bolted. He ran down the hall toward the stairwell, arms flailing, not looking back, his boots slipping on the wet floor. Puckett heard him take the stairs 2 at a time, heard the crack of wood breaking under his weight, heard the crash as he slammed through the back door and out into the night. Then silence. One down. Puckett checked the apartment the man had been sleeping in. A nest of blankets in the corner, some empty cans, Chef Boyardee ravioli, Dinty Moore beef stew. The labels faded and peeling, a lighter with a cartoon character on it, the image worn away by years of thumbing. A spoon with burn marks on the underside, the metal discolored and warped. A glass pipe on the windowsill, the bowl blackened and cracked, residue crusted around the opening. Nothing worth taking. He moved on. The hallway stretched ahead of him, doors hanging open on both sides like mouths. Most of the apartments were empty, but in one he found a makeshift altar. Candles arranged in a circle around a photograph of a woman, rosary beads draped over the frame. The candles were burned down to nubs, wax pooled on the floor in frozen white puddles. The photograph was water damage, the woman's face blurred and faded, her features melting into abstraction. She could have been anyone. Could have been everyone. Puckett stepped over the candles and kept moving, his boots leaving prints in the dust. At the end of the hall, he found another occupied apartment. He could tell because the door was closed, and when he pressed his ear against it, he heard movement inside, shuffling footsteps. Someone coughing, trying to muffle the sound. At least 2 people, maybe more. He pulled the Bluetooth speaker from the duffel and set it on the floor outside the door. He scrolled through the sound files on his phone, selected one, a woman screaming, high and desperate. The kind of scream that cut straight through you like a blade, and hit play. The speaker crackled to life. The scream echoed through the hallway, impossibly loud in the enclosed space, bouncing off the walls and ceiling and floor. Inside the apartment, someone yelled. Then another voice, panicked. higher pitched. The door flew open, and a woman stumbled out. Maybe 30 years old, her hair tangled, eyes red-rimmed from crying or exhaustion, or both. She was clutching a backpack to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her alive, her knuckles white from gripping the straps. Behind her came a younger man, 25 at most, pulling a second woman by the arm, trying to keep her upright. They didn't see Puckett in the dark. They ran straight for the stairwell and disappeared, their footsteps echoing down the shaft, fading gone. Puckett waited until the sound faded completely, then turned off the speaker. He walked into the apartment they'd abandoned, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. 3 sleeping bags on the floor, a camp stove, some canned food stacked against the wall in a careful pyramid. A plastic tarp hung over the broken window to block the wind, but the wind was coming through anyway, lifting the edges of the tarp, making it snap and flutter like a trapped bird. The temperature in the room was maybe 10 degrees. Puckett didn't know how anyone could sleep in this, how anyone could wake up in this and decide it was worth doing again tomorrow. He checked the other rooms, empty. 4 people gone. 1 or 2 more in the building, tops. Maybe. Landry had said there were at least 6 squatters, but maybe some had already left on their own, spooked by the cold or the stories people told about the Elkhorn. There were stories. Puckett had heard them back when he was a deputy. People said the building was haunted, that you could hear voices in the walls at night, that shadows moved in the empty rooms even when there was no light to cast them. He'd never believed any of it, but he understood why people did. A building like this, abandoned and rotting, it felt wrong even when you knew there was nothing supernatural about it. Physics and decay. That's what he told himself. Didn't help. The 4th floor was colder than the others. The heat had never worked up here, even when the building was occupied, and now with the broken windows and the wind coming through, it felt like the inside of a freezer. Puckett's fingers were numb even inside the gloves. He flexed them as he walked, trying to keep the circulation going, feeling the joints crack and pop. His breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating. He could see the moisture freezing in his beard, tiny crystals of ice forming on the individual hairs. Most of the apartments up here were empty, doors missing entirely, torn off for firewood years ago. But at the far end of the hall, he saw candlelight flickering through a doorway, warm and orange against the darkness, impossibly inviting. He approached slow, the duffel slung over one shoulder and the megaphone in his left hand. The Glock was in the duffel, but he didn't reach for it yet. He stopped just outside the door and listened. Voices inside, young, maybe teenagers. The strike of a match. Someone laughing nervously. He pressed the megaphone trigger. The moan was louder this time, distorted into something almost animal, echoing through the empty building like a voice from the bottom of a well. The voices stopped. Puckett moaned again, then switched to the Bluetooth speaker, pulling it from the duffel and setting it on the floor. He scrolled through the sound files and selected one. Chains dragging across concrete, slow and rhythmic, metal scraping stone. The sound of something being dragged somewhere didn't want to go. He hit play, and the speaker crackled to life, the sound filling the hallway, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Someone inside the apartment screamed. Puckett stepped back into the shadows and waited. A woman ran out first, wild-eyed, clutching a backpack to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 19, her face pale, lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. Behind her came a man, younger, maybe 17, stumbling, nearly falling, catching himself on the doorframe. They didn't see Puckett in the dark. They ran straight for the stairwell and disappeared, the sound of their footsteps echoing down into the building's depths. Puckett picked up the speaker and turned it off. He walked into the apartment they'd abandoned, the candlelight casting his shadow long and distorted across the walls, making him look taller than he was, thinner, like something that had been stretched on a rack. A single sleeping bag on the floor, unzipped and spread flat like someone had been using it as a blanket. 2 dirty comforters piled on top. A small hibachi grill near the window, the kind people used for camping. Charcoal still in it, but never lit. Cardboard and duct tape covering the broken window, doing a better job blocking the wind than the tarp downstairs. In the corner, someone had arranged a pile of books. Paperback romance novels, their covers curled and faded, the pages swollen with moisture. Next to the books was a stuffed animal, a bear with one eye missing, its fur matted and dirty, loved to pieces. He checked the other rooms, empty. 6 people gone. The building should be clear now. Puckett stood in the empty apartment, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. $800 for a few hours of work. Not bad. He'd scared off desperate people before, back when he was a deputy, evicting families who couldn't pay rent, clearing out homeless camps under the overpass. This wasn't any different. People needed to be somewhere, and sometimes you had to make them understand they couldn't be here. He was halfway back to the stairwell when he heard it. His own voice. It was coming from somewhere below him, echoing up through the stairwell shaft. His voice calling out, "Puckett." Just his name. Nothing else. But it was his voice. Exactly his voice. Same flat affect. Same Eastern Kentucky drawl he'd never fully lost even after 18 years in West Virginia. The cadence was right. The timbre was right. Even the slight rasp from 2 decades of smoking Marlboro Reds was right. He froze. He stood at the top of the stairs and shone his flashlight down to the shaft. Nothing. Just the empty stairwell and the dark, the graffiti on the walls, the broken steps, the way down disappearing into blackness. The voice came again. "Puckett, you up there?" Fainter now, like it was moving away. Like whatever was making the sound was walking deeper into the building, away from the stairwell, calling back over its shoulder. He didn't move. His hand drifted to the duffel, fingers closing around the grip of the Glock. He pulled it out, flicked off the safety, held it low. The gun felt heavy and cold in his hand, the metal sucking the heat out of his palm even through the glove. It couldn't be a recording. He hadn't recorded himself saying his own name. And none of the squatters knew who he was. He'd never spoken to any of them, never identified himself. He'd just made noise and watched them run. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the stairwell. It was behind him, inside the walls. "Puckett, I know you're up there." The voice was muffled but clear, coming from somewhere inside the plaster and lath, somewhere in the wall cavity right there beside him. Puckett spun around, flashlight beam sweeping the hallway. Nothing. Just the cracked plaster and the open doorways and the sound of wind rattling the broken windows. But the voice had been close, right there, on the other side of the wall, maybe 6 inches away from where he stood. Then he heard footsteps. Not on the floorboards, inside the walls, moving fast, parallel to where he stood, heading toward the far end of the hall. The footsteps weren't trying to be quiet. They were deliberate, purposeful. Like whatever was making them wanted to be heard. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Puckett stood there in the dark, listening, barely breathing. The cold pressed against him, seeping through his coat, through his gloves, settling into his bones like an infection. His flashlight beam wavered. His hand holding the Glock was shaking, but not from the cold. Then from somewhere inside the walls near the stairwell, his own voice again. "Puckett, I've been watching you all night. Watching you scare those people, making them run. You're good at it." The voice paused. "You've done it before, haven't you? Back when you wore that badge. Made people leave. Made them understand they weren't welcome. You're real good at making people scared." His voice came out rough when he found it. "Who are you?" For a long moment, nothing. Just the wind and the creak of old wood and the sound of his own breathing. Then his own voice again, coming from a different spot now, closer to the middle of the hall. "Who are you?" Perfect mimicry. Not just the words, but the rough whisper, the fear underneath it. The way his voice had cracked slightly on the second word. Puckett wanted to leave. Every instinct told him to turn around, walk back down the stairs, get in his truck, and drive away. $800 wasn't worth this. Nothing was worth this. But his legs wouldn't move. He stood frozen, the Glock aimed at the wall, waiting for something to happen. The wall bulged. Just slightly, just for a second, right there at eye level. Like someone had pressed against it from the other side, testing it, seeing how much pressure it would take to break through. The plaster cracked. A thin vertical line appearing in the surface, dust sifting down like snow. Puckett fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash lit up the hallway like lightning, freezing everything in stark white and black. The bullet punched through the plaster and into the wall cavity beyond, embedding in the wooden framework with a solid thunk. The footsteps started again, faster now, moving away. Puckett tracked them with the gun, firing twice more, the bullets punching holes in the wall. Plaster exploding in white clouds that hung in the air, made the flashlight beam visible like a solid thing. Then nothing. Silence. He waited, breathing hard, and the gun still raised. His ears were ringing from the shots. Smoke drifted from the barrel, acrid and sharp, mixing with the smell of mold and decay. He'd fired 3 rounds. That left 12 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. The footsteps came again, but this time from below. On the 3rd floor, moving toward the stairwell, moving toward the way out, Puckett ran. He sprinted down the hall to the stairwell and took the stairs 2 at a time, his boots pounding on the wood. The stairs groaned and swayed under him. One step splintered and his foot punched through, but he caught himself on the wall and kept going, yanking his leg free, ignoring the splinters that dug through his jeans into his shin. He reached the 3rd floor and swept the flashlight across the hallway, empty. Nothing moving. But he could hear breathing now, close, somewhere in the walls, slow and steady, like whoever was in there wasn't even trying to hide anymore, like they wanted him to know they were there. He walked toward the sound, the Glock held in both hands now, aimed straight ahead. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, looking for movement, for any sign of where the sound was coming from, for any indication of what was doing this. He found it near the middle of the hall, in one of the gutted apartments. A section of wall where the plaster had been pulled away deliberately, exposing the wooden studs underneath. The opening was maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, low to the floor, like a crawlspace entrance, like a door into somewhere people weren't supposed to go. He crouched down and shone the flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow vertical shaft between the studs, descending into darkness. He could see scratches in the wood, deep gouges made by something hard, maybe a knife or a screwdriver. Handprints in the dust, worn smooth from repeated use. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but someone had been using it, moving through the walls, watching. Puckett holstered the Glock in his waistband and set the duffel bag on the floor. He pulled out the crowbar, gripped it in one hand, and squeezed through the opening, the flashlight gripped between his teeth, the beam bouncing with each movement. The space was tighter than he'd expected. His shoulders scraped against the studs on both sides, the wood rough even through his coat. He had to move sideways, inching forward, the flashlight beam jerking with each shuffle. The air inside the wall was stale and thick with dust. Insulation hung in torn strips from the framework above him. Ancient pink fiberglass that crumbled at the touch, releasing particles that made his eyes water and his throat close up. He tried not to breathe too deep, tried to keep moving. He moved slowly, following the scratches in the wood. The passage turned and descended at an angle, following the slope of the floor joists. He could hear his own breathing amplified in the confined space, ragged and too fast, and something else. A faint rustling ahead of him, like fabric moving, like someone shifting position, waiting. The passage opened into a wider space where two walls intersected, forming a small cavity maybe 4 feet across and 5 feet tall, just barely enough room to crouch, to turn around, to exist. Puckett emerged into it and swept the flashlight around. The cavity was full of stuff, not trash, belongings. There were blankets bundled in the corner, old wool blankets stained dark with God knows what, folded with care despite the filth, a kerosene lantern, the glass chimney blackened with soot but intact. A plastic jug of water, half full, the water cloudy but probably drinkable. A metal toolbox rusted shut, the latch broken. A stack of magazines, the pages yellowed and brittle, the dates on the covers from the late 80s and early 90s. Newspapers, too, carefully folded, headlines about the bank robbery, about the investigation, about the manhunt that never found anyone. And stacked against one wall, wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting, tied with rope that had been retied many times, bundles of cash. Puckett stared at them. Even through the plastic, he could see they were old bills, faded, bundled with rubber bands that had rotted and snapped and been replaced with string. There were dozens of bundles, maybe more, stuffed into the wall cavity like insulation, like they were keeping something warm. More money than Puckett had ever seen in his life. More money than he'd ever imagined having. He reached out and pulled one bundle free. The plastic crinkled, loud in the confined space. He tore it open and held the bills up to the flashlight. 20s and 50s, dated 1987, 1988, 1989. The bills smelled like mildew and old paper and something else, something biological and rotten, like they'd been stored next to meat that had gone bad. He dropped the bundle and turned, sweeping the flashlight across the cavity. That's when he saw the man. He was pressed into the far corner, crouched low, his body wedged between the studs, in a space that didn't look big enough to fit a human being. He was old, 70, maybe older, his face gaunt and bearded, skin hanging loose on his skull like it belonged to someone bigger. His eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, yellow-green and unblinking. No humanity in them at all. He wore layers of clothing, all of it filthy, crusted with dirt and grease and things Puckett didn't want to think about. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, the cloth stained dark, wrapped and rewrapped so many times it was impossible to tell what was cloth and what was skin. He didn't move. He just stared at Puckett, watching, waiting, barely breathing. Puckett pulled the Glock from his waistband and aimed it at the man. His hands were shaking. He steadied the gun with both hands, took a breath. His voice came out rough when he found it. "Who the hell are you?" The old man tilted his head slightly like he was considering the question. Like he'd forgotten how to answer questions, forgotten how language worked, forgotten what it meant to be human. Then he opened his mouth and spoke, and the voice that came out was Puckett's voice, perfect and flat and identical. "Who the hell are you?" Puckett tightened his grip on the gun, finger on the trigger, ready to fire. But he didn't fire. He needed to understand what he was looking at, what he'd walked into. The old man smiled. His teeth were brown and broken, some missing entirely, the gums black and receded. When he smiled, you could see the skull underneath, see what he'd looked like dead. Puckett knew who he was. He didn't know the name, but he knew the story. Everyone in McDowell County over the age of 40 knew the story. In August 1989, the First National Bank in Welch was robbed by a single man in a ski mask. He'd walked in 10 minutes before closing, held a revolver on the tellers, and walked out with 2 duffel bags containing close to $3 million in cash. Deposits from the coal company payrolls, insurance settlements, savings accounts from families who'd spent their whole lives saving, who'd never see that money again. The FBI investigated for months. They interviewed everyone in town, searched every abandoned building and mine shaft within 50 miles, offered a reward that got bigger each year. But the man was never caught. The money was never recovered. The case went cold. 30 years ago. The old man in the wall was the bank robber. He'd been living inside the Elkhorn Hotel for 3 decades, hiding with the money, moving through the walls, surviving in the crawl spaces and cavities of a condemned building, watching the world outside change, watching the town die, watching people come and go, waiting. Puckett lowered the gun slightly, his mind racing. Then he understood. Landry knew. Landry had to know. That's why he'd hired Puckett to clear out squatters from a building already scheduled for demolition. That's why $800 to scare off a few homeless people. That's why tonight, 3 days before the bulldozers came, this wasn't a frightener job. This was a trap. He sent you, Puckett said. Not a question. A statement. The old man didn't respond with Puckett's voice this time. He tilted his head the other way, studying Puckett like an insect under glass. Then he reached into the pile of belongings beside him and pulled out something. A newspaper clipping, old and yellow, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. He held it up. The headline read, "Property Developer Acquires Condemned Buildings." The article was from 6 months ago. Landry's face smiled from the grainy photograph. The article mentioned the Elkhorn specifically. Scheduled for demolition January 2nd, 2020. Lot to be cleared and sold. The old man lowered the clipping and pointed at Puckett, then at himself. Then he drew his cloth-wrapped finger across his throat in a slow, deliberate line. Both dead. And that was the plan. Puckett backed toward the opening he'd crawled through, keeping the gun aimed at the old man. His shoulders scraped the studs. Dust filled his mouth. He reached the opening and squeezed out into the apartment. Stumbling, catching himself against the wall, he had to get out. Had to get out now. He ran down the hallway, down the stairs, his boots pounding on the wood, the sound echoing through the empty building like gunshots. The stairwell swayed under him. He reached the second floor, kept going, reached the first. He sprinted down the main hallway toward the back entrance, toward the loading dock where he'd come in, toward escape. He grabbed the door handle and pulled. Locked. The door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, putting his weight into it. Nothing. He shone the flashlight at the mechanism and saw why. Someone had driven a steel wedge between the door and the frame from the outside, jamming it shut. The wedge was industrial, the kind used to secure shipping containers. It would take tools and time to remove. He turned and ran to the front entrance. The main doors had heavy drop bars across them on the outside. He'd seen them when he drove up. Old security hardware from when the building was abandoned. Someone had lowered the bars while he was inside. He pushed against the doors anyway, throwing his shoulder into them. They didn't move. Solid, sealed. Both exits blocked. Not bricked up. That would take hours. But blocked. Wedged shut. Secured from the outside. Quick. Quiet. Efficient. While he'd been upstairs making noise, someone had locked him in. Puckett stood in the lobby, bent forward slightly, hands braced on his knees, waiting for his breathing to even out. He pulled out his phone. No signal. The building's thick brick walls had always made cell reception spotty, but now there was nothing. Not even one bar. He tried anyway, dialing Landry's number with shaking fingers. The call didn't go through. He tried 911. Same thing. The screen showed the number, showed the call timer starting, but there was no connection. No help coming. From somewhere above him, deep inside the building, his own voice called out again, "You ain't leaving." The voice echoed down through the stairwell, bouncing off the walls, multiplying. Puckett couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It seemed to be everywhere at once. "Nobody's coming for you, Puckett. Nobody knows you're here. Nobody's gonna miss you for days, maybe weeks. And by then you'll be frozen solid, just another body in the rubble." Puckett backed away from the front entrance, the gun raised, sweeping it across the dark hallway. His flashlight beam couldn't reach the shadows in the corners, couldn't penetrate the darkness of the open doorways. Anything could be in there. Anything could be watching. Puckett tried to swallow, couldn't get past the constriction. "You think you're the first one he sent?" the voice continued, still using Puckett's exact inflection, his cadence, his accent. "You think you're special? There was someone before you. Last year, a man named Tucker. Landry sent him in to do the same thing. Clear out the squatters. Make the building scary. Easy money. Tucker didn't make it out, Puckett. He's still here. Up on the 4th floor. Been there for 13 months now. Froze to death trying to dig through that wedged door with his bare hands. You'll find him if you look. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be too busy trying not to end up the same way." The voice paused. Puckett could hear his own breathing, ragged and too fast, echoing back at him from the empty building. "But you will. End up the same way, I mean. Because there's no way out. The doors are locked. The windows are too high to jump from without breaking your legs. And even if you did jump, even if you made it to the ground, where would you go? Back to that efficiency apartment? Back to owing money you can't pay? Back to working bottom-dollar jobs for nothing money until you die? At least here it'll be quick. Cold's not a bad way to go once you stop fighting it. You just get tired, then you sleep. Then you don't wake up. Peaceful, almost." Puckett forced himself to think. Stop listening to his own voice telling him he was going to die. There had to be a way out. Had to be. The building had a basement. He'd seen the stairs leading down when he'd checked the ground floor earlier, but he hadn't gone down there. Basements in old buildings like this usually had coal chutes, delivery entrances, ways to bring fuel in from the street without going through the building. If the old man had been living here for 30 years, he'd need access to the basement. Need it for water, maybe, or for another way in and out. If Puckett could find it, he could escape. He went back through the main hallway, moving fast but careful, checking each shadow before passing it. The basement stairs were near the back of the building, in a small alcove off the main corridor. The door was missing, just an empty frame, and beyond it a wooden staircase descending into blackness. He shone the flashlight down. The stairs were intact. The walls on either side bare stone, slick with moisture. He could see maybe 10 steps before the beam disappeared into dark. He started down one step at a time, testing each board before putting his weight on it. The air got colder as he descended, and damper, the smell of water and mold stronger, mixed with something else. Earth, maybe, or stone that had been wet for so long it had started to decompose. His breath fogged in front of him, thick white clouds that hung in the stillness. The basement was larger than he'd expected. A single open space that extended under the entire footprint of the building. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet, supported by brick pillars spaced every 15 feet. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, with water pooled in the low spots. The water was frozen solid now. Sheets of ice that reflected the flashlight beam made the space seem bigger than it was, made it seem like the floor went down forever. Puckett swept the light around, looking for exits, for windows, for anything that might lead outside. The walls were stone, original construction, from when the building was first erected in 1923. No windows, no doors visible, just stone and mortar and darkness and the sound of water dripping somewhere, the steady plip, plip, plip of moisture falling from the ceiling into puddles. But at the far end of the basement, near what he figured was the front of the building, he saw something. A wooden door set into the stone wall, held shut, with a heavy iron bar across the frame. Old hardware, old construction, the kind they didn't make anymore. He walked toward it, his boots crunching on the ice, each step echoing off the stone walls. When he reached the door, he grabbed the iron bar and tried to lift it. It didn't move. The bar was frozen in place, ice welding it to the metal brackets, fusing it solid. He set the flashlight on the floor, aimed at the door, and pulled with both hands. The bar groaned but didn't budge. He grabbed the crowbar from his belt and wedged it under the bar, using it as a lever. He pulled down hard, putting his weight into it, ignoring the pain in his cold, stiffened fingers. The ice cracked. The bar shifted, lifting slightly, the ancient metal screaming. He pulled again, harder, and the bar came free with a screech that echoed through the basement like a siren. He lifted the bar out of the brackets and let it drop to the floor with a heavy clang that made his ears ring. Then he grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door opened inward, swinging on rusted hinges that squealed. Cold air poured through the opening, colder even than the basement, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else, something old. Beyond the door was another space, smaller, maybe 10 feet square. The walls were stone, the ceiling low. It looked like a coal room, a place where they used to store fuel for the building's furnace back when coal was cheap and plentiful and the town was alive. But there was no coal now, just empty space and stone walls and the smell of age. And another opening. Not a door this time, a passage, maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved through the stone foundation. The walls were rough, hand-chiseled, and the floor was dirt and rock, packed hard from years of use. The tunnel extended into darkness, sloping slightly upward, heading toward the street. Puckett crouched down and shone the flashlight inside. He could see maybe 20 feet before the beam disappeared. The tunnel looked old, maybe as old as the building itself. Coal chute. Had to be. The walls were hand-chiseled, the kind of work they did in the 20s when labor was cheap, and coal kept the town alive. If the tunnel connected to the street, it might not be blocked. It might still be open. It might be his way out. He got down on his hands and knees and crawled inside, pushing the flashlight ahead of him, the gun still tucked in his waistband. The tunnel was tight, the ceiling scraping his back, pressing down on him. The walls pressed in on both sides. He moved forward inch by inch, his breath echoing in the confined space, his knees aching on the hard-packed dirt. After maybe 30 feet, the tunnel turned and started climbing more steeply. Dirt floor gave way to stone steps, narrow, uneven, carved directly into the rock, worn smooth in the middle from decades of use. He climbed, knees protesting, hands numb from cold and rough stone. The tunnel narrowed. His shoulders scraped the walls with every movement. Then he saw light. Not much. Just a faint gray glow ahead, filtering down from above. Daylight. Or street light. Something from outside. Something that meant escape. He crawled faster, ignoring the pain in his knees, ignoring the way the walls scraped his shoulders and back, ignoring everything except the light ahead. The light grew brighter. He could see the end of the tunnel now, maybe 10 feet ahead, opening into a grate. The tunnel ended at a metal grate set into the sidewalk, the kind they used for basement ventilation. The grate was maybe 2 feet square, heavy iron bars spaced 4 inches apart. Through the gaps, Puckett could see the street outside, covered in snow, pristine and untouched. He could see the bottom of a streetlight pole, He could see his truck parked across the street, exactly where he'd left it. So close. He grabbed the grate and pushed. It didn't move. He pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. The grate shifted slightly, scraping against the concrete frame, but it didn't lift. It was secured somehow from the outside. He couldn't see how. Bolts, maybe, or a locking mechanism. He pulled the crowbar from his belt and wedged it between the grate and the frame, trying to pry it loose. The crowbar slipped. He tried again, finding better purchase, and pulled down hard. Something gave. Metal scraping metal. A bolt shearing. He repositioned the crowbar and pulled again. Another sound of breaking metal. The grate shifted. He grabbed it with both hands and pushed. It lifted an inch, then 2 inches. Cold air rushing through the gap, carrying the smell of snow and exhaust and freedom. He could see the street now, could see the sky pale gray with dawn coming. He pushed harder. The grate lifted higher. He got one arm through the gap, then his head, then his shoulders. He was halfway out when he heard it. Footsteps behind him. In the tunnel, coming fast. He pulled himself up, kicking his legs, trying to get out before whatever was behind him reached him. His chest scraped against the concrete frame, the metal rough and cold. His coat snagged on something. He yanked it free and pulled himself up onto the sidewalk, rolling onto his back in the snow. He looked down at the grate. The old man was there, pressed against the grate from below, his face pushed up against the iron bars. His eyes were wide, his mouth open, his teeth bared. He was making a sound, low and continuous, somewhere between a growl and a moan, something that didn't sound human. Then he spoke, and the voice was Puckett's voice again, perfect and identical. "You ain't getting out that easy." Puckett scrambled backward in the snow, away from the grate, his boots slipping on the ice. He pulled the Glock from his waistband and aimed it at the old man's face, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the gun steady. The old man smiled up at him through the bars, his broken teeth catching the streetlight. Then he reached up with both hands, those cloth-wrapped hands, those hands that had held a gun in a bank 30 years ago, those hands that had lived in walls, and grabbed the grate. He pulled it down from inside, the metal scraping concrete. Sealing himself back inside the tunnel, Puckett heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the grate from below, blocking it, making sure it couldn't be opened again from inside or out. He stood up, breathing hard, and looked around. The street was empty. No cars, no people. Just snow and darkness and the faint glow of dawn on the horizon, turning the sky from black to gray. His truck was still there, parked where he'd left it hours ago, covered now in a thin layer of fresh snow. He ran toward it, slipping on the ice, catching himself, running again. He reached the truck and yanked the door open, climbed inside. His hands were shaking so hard, he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over, rough and reluctant in the cold, coughing, sputtering. It died. He tried again. The starter ground. The engine caught. He threw the truck into gear and floored it. The tires spun in the snow and then caught. The truck lurched forward, fishtailing, straightening, finding traction. He didn't look back. He just drove, following the empty streets out of Welch, heading east toward Bluefield, toward anywhere that wasn't here. He drove for hours, not really paying attention to where he was going, just following the roads east through the mountains. The sun came up behind him, pale and weak through the clouds. The snow kept falling. By the time he crossed into Virginia, he was exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. He pulled into a rest stop outside of Bluefield and parked in the far corner of the lot, away from the other cars. He left the engine running, the heat on, and sat there staring at the dashboard, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand. Landry had tried to have him killed, had hired him to walk into a trap, had locked him inside a building with a man who'd been living in walls for 30 years. Had expected them both to die so he could bulldoze the building and take the money. Simple. Clean. No witnesses. Except Puckett had gotten out, had found the tunnel, had broken through the grate, had escaped. And now Landry didn't know if Puckett was alive or dead. Didn't know what Puckett knew. Didn't know if Puckett would talk. That made Puckett dangerous. That made him a problem. Puckett sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the snow falling outside. Then he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, heading south this time, away from West Virginia entirely, toward Tennessee maybe, or North Carolina, somewhere far enough away that Landry couldn't reach him, somewhere he could disappear. He didn't know what he was going to do when he got there. Didn't know how he was going to survive with no money and no job and no references. But he knew he couldn't stay here. Couldn't stay anywhere near Welch or Landry or that building. The Elkhorn would burn eventually. Maybe not from the old man setting fire to it. Maybe just from time and decay, and the fact that condemned buildings in towns like Welch had a way of catching fire right before they were supposed to be demolished. The old man would get out before that happened. Had 30 years of practice living in walls, moving through buildings, surviving in places that should have killed him. And the money would burn with the building, or Landry would find it in the rubble, or the FBI would find it eventually when they investigated whatever fire consumed the Elkhorn. Puckett would never know, would never see any of it, would just have the memory of that night, of being trapped, of hearing his own voice calling to him from inside the walls. 3 weeks passed. Puckett stayed at a motel in Princeton for 5 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, just lying on the bed with all the lights on and the television playing. On the 6th day, he forced himself to get up, to shower, to think about what came next. He couldn't stay at the motel forever. $40 a night added up fast, and he had maybe $300 left in his wallet. No income, no job prospects, no plan. He needed work. Something that paid cash. Something that didn't require references or background checks. Something that let him keep his head down. He found a lumber yard on the south side of Princeton that was hiring day laborers. The work was hard, loading trucks, stacking pallets, moving heavy loads in the cold. But the pay was cash at the end of each day, $10 an hour, no questions asked. He started the next morning. The work was mindless and exhausting, which was exactly what he needed. By the end of each day, he was too tired to think, too tired to remember, too tired to do anything but walk back to the motel and collapse. He moved to a cheaper motel after the first week, $35 a night, even smaller, even more depressing, but it saved him money. He kept to himself. Didn't make friends at the lumberyard. Didn't talk more than necessary. Just showed up, did the work, took the cash, left. The other workers got the message. They stopped trying to make conversation, stopped inviting him to go get beers after work, just let him be. On his 14th day in Princeton, he walked past a newspaper box on his way back to the motel and saw the headline. Historic Welch Hotel destroyed in fire. He stopped and stared at it through the scratched plastic window of the newspaper box. Then he fed quarters into the slot and pulled out a copy. The Elkhorn Hotel had burned down 3 nights ago, according to the article. The fire had started around 2 in the morning, cause unknown but suspected to be squatters using open flames for heat. The building had been completely destroyed. The fire department had let it burn in a controlled manner rather than risk sending firefighters into the unstable structure. No injuries reported. The lot would be cleared and sold as planned. The article included a quote from Landry, the property owner. He expressed sadness at the loss of a historic building, but noted that the demolition had been scheduled anyway, So the fire had simply accelerated the timeline. The investigation was ongoing. No mention of bodies found in the rubble. No mention of money. No mention of anyone being trapped inside. Puckett read the article 3 times, standing there on the sidewalk, the cold wind cutting through his coat. Then he folded the paper and shoved it in his pocket and kept walking. The old man had gotten out. Had to have gotten out. The article would have mentioned if they'd found remains, unless the fire had been hot enough to destroy everything, to burn bone to ash, to leave nothing to find. But Puckett didn't think so. He thought the old man had gotten out the same way he always got out, through whatever secret passage he used, whatever route through the walls only he knew about. And the money had burned. $3 million, gone. Turned to ash. Or maybe Landry had gotten to it first, had sent someone in before the fire, had recovered what he could. Puckett would never know. He went back to work the next day like nothing had changed. Loaded trucks, stacked pallets, took his cash. The routine was comforting, predictable, safe. On his 21st day in Princeton, he found the envelope. He was walking back to the motel after work, exhausted and sore, thinking about nothing except getting horizontal and maybe sleeping for more than 3 hours, when he noticed his motel room door was slightly ajar. Just a crack, maybe an inch, but enough to see that the latch hadn't caught. He stopped 10 feet away and stared at it. He always locked the door. Always checked it twice before leaving. Always. He pulled the Glock from his waistband. He started carrying it everywhere now, and always loaded, always ready, and approached slowly. He pushed the door open with his foot, gun raised, sweeping the room. Empty. Nobody in the bathroom. Nobody in the closet. Nobody under the bed. Just the room exactly as he'd left it. The television off, the lights off, the bed made, everything normal. Except for the envelope on the bed. It was white, letter-sized, thick. His name was written on it in neat handwriting. Puckett. He picked it up, his hand starting to shake. The envelope wasn't sealed. He opened it. Inside was cash. $100 bills, rubber banded together. He pulled them out and counted. $5,000, and underneath the cash, a photograph. Puckett pulled it out and looked at it. The photograph showed him walking into his motel room. This motel room. Taken from across the parking lot, probably earlier that same day. Maybe that morning when he'd left for work. The image was clear, sharp. His face was visible. The room number on the door was visible. There was nothing written on the photograph. No message, no explanation. Just the image and the money. Puckett stared at it for a long time. Then he walked to the window and looked out across the parking lot. Nothing. No cars that looked suspicious. No people watching. Just the usual collection of beat-up vehicles and travelers passing through. He went back to the bed and looked at the envelope again. The handwriting, the way his name was written, careful and deliberate. He knew what it meant. The old man had survived, had gotten out of the Elkhorn before it burned, and somehow, impossibly, he'd found Puckett. Had followed him to Princeton, had watched him, had learned where he was staying, had broken into his room, or just walked in. The locks on these doors were garbage, and left the money, a message, or a payment, or both. Puckett sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph in one hand, the cash in the other, trying to understand. $5,000. More money than he'd make at the lumber yard in months, maybe 6 months. Money he desperately needed. Money that could get him out of this dump motel, could get him somewhere safer, somewhere better. But it was the old man's money, the bank robbery money. The money that had been hidden in the walls for 30 years, the money that was supposed to have burned. And accepting it meant what? That he was connected to it now, that he was part of it, that he owed something. He looked at the photograph again, looked at himself, captured walking into the room, unaware he was being watched. The message was clear. I can find you. I can reach you. I know where you are. Puckett put the cash and the photograph back in the envelope and shoved it under the mattress. Then he packed his duffel bag. It didn't take long. He barely had anything. And checked out of the motel. Told the clerk he was leaving early, forfeiting the rest of the week he'd paid for. The clerk didn't care. He drove south, deeper into Tennessee, putting distance between himself and Princeton. He didn't know if it would help. Didn't know if you could run from something that had already found you once. But he had to try. He ended up in Crossville, a small town off Interstate 50. Big enough to get lost in, but small enough that work was available if you knew where to look. He found a job at a storage facility, night shift, doing maintenance and cleaning, and basically just sitting in an office making sure nobody broke in. The pay was nothing, $9 an hour, but it was steady and they didn't ask questions. He rented a room in a boarding house run by a woman who didn't care who you were as long as the rent came on time. $80 a week, shared bathroom, no kitchen, but it had a lock on the door and nobody bothered him. The money from the envelope, the $5,000, he kept hidden. Didn't spend it, didn't touch it. Just kept it under the floorboard in his room, wrapped in plastic, along with the photograph. He told himself he'd spend it when he had to, when things got desperate, when he had no other choice. But he didn't need to. The storage facility job was enough to cover rent and food, barely, but enough. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. Puckett fell into a routine, work at night, sleep during the day, keep his head down, avoid people. The fear started to fade, or at least dull. He stopped checking over his shoulder constantly. Stopped jumping at every sound in the walls of the boarding house. Stopped sleeping with the gun under his pillow. Started to feel like maybe he'd gotten away. And then in March, the second envelope arrived. He found it on his doorstep one morning when he got home from work. Same white envelope. Same neat handwriting. His name, Puckett. Inside, $10,000 in hundreds, and another photograph. This photograph showed him at work, at the storage facility, standing in the office, visible through the window, his face illuminated by the desk lamp. Taken from outside the fence, probably at night. No message, just the image and the money. Puckett stood there in the hallway of the boarding house, staring at the photograph, feeling the fear come flooding back. It wasn't safe, had never been safe. The old man had found him again. He took the envelope inside and hid it with the first one, under the floorboard. $15,000 total now. More than he'd ever had saved. Money that felt like poison, like a curse, like something he should throw away but couldn't. Because he needed it. Because he might need it more later. Because refusing it wouldn't change anything. The old man would still know where he was, would still be watching. Puckett stayed in Crossville. What else could he do? Running hadn't helped the first time. Wouldn't help now. So he stayed, and he worked, and he waited for the next envelope. It came in May. $15,000 this time, and a photograph of him sleeping. Taken from inside his room somehow, through the window maybe, or through a crack in the door. His face visible on the pillow, eyes closed, vulnerable. The old man had been inside his room, or right outside it. Close enough to take the photograph. Close enough to kill him if he'd wanted to. But he hadn't. Puckett added the money to the stash under the floorboard. $30,000 now. A fortune. A prison. On a Sunday morning in late June, Puckett woke up to find the fourth envelope. It had been slipped under his door during the night. He almost stepped on it. Inside, no money this time. Just a photograph. The photograph showed a grate in a sidewalk. The same grate Puckett had crawled through that night in December. The grate above the tunnel. the grate that led out of the Elkhorn's basement. And pressed against the grate from below, looking up at the camera, was a face. The old man's face. But it looked different now. The beard was trimmed shorter. The skin looked cleaner. The eyes were clearer, more focused. He looked almost normal, almost human, almost like someone you might pass on the street and never notice. He was smiling in the photograph, that same broken-toothed smile. But the smile looked different now, not threatening, not predatory, almost friendly. On the back of the photograph, written in that same neat handwriting, was a single sentence. You were never there. Puckett stared at the words for a long time. Then he turned the photograph over and looked at the old man's face again. At that smile, at those eyes. You were never there. What did that mean? That Puckett should forget what happened? That he should pretend that night never occurred? That the old man had given him a gift? Survival, escape, freedom. And now Puckett just needed to accept it and move on? Or was it a threat? A reminder that no one knew Puckett had been in the Elkhorn that night, that no one would believe him if he told them, that any attempt to talk about it would just make him look crazy or guilty or both. He didn't know. He put the photograph with the others under the floorboard. The envelope stopped after that. No more money, no more photographs, just silence. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. A year passed. Puckett kept working at the storage facility and kept living in the boarding house, kept waiting for the next envelope, the next sign that the old man was still watching. But nothing came. He used some of the money eventually. Had to. The boarding house raised the rent, and then his truck needed repairs he couldn't afford on storage facility wages. He pulled out a few $1,000s, told himself it was temporary, told himself he'd replace it somehow. But he never did. And slowly over months, the stack of cash under the floorboard got smaller as life bled it away. Rent, food, repairs, medical bills when he twisted his ankle at work. All the small disasters that poverty attracts. By the time spring came around again, he'd spend most of it. $27,000 gone. He still had maybe $3,000 left. Not much, but more than he'd ever had before that night in the Elkhorn. And the photographs. He kept those. All 4 of them. Looked at them sometimes, late at night, trying to understand what they meant. What the old man wanted. Why he'd done any of it. But the answers never came. One evening in early May, almost 18 months after he'd left Welch, Puckett was walking back to the boarding house from the corner store, carrying a bag of groceries, when he heard it. His own voice. Puckett. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, and the bag of groceries frozen in his hands. The voice had come from somewhere close. Maybe across the street. Maybe behind him. He couldn't tell. He turned slowly, looking. The street was empty. No cars, no people. Just the late afternoon light slanting through the trees, making long shadows on the pavement. Puckett, the voice said again. Closer this time. Right behind him. He spun around. Nobody. Just the empty sidewalk and the houses and the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the distance. He stood there for a long moment, pulse thumping in his ears, the groceries forgotten in his hands. He scanned every shadow, every doorway, every tree, looking for movement, looking for eyes, looking for any sign. Nothing. Just his imagination. Just paranoia, just the voice in his head that he'd never been able to fully silence. He started walking again, faster now, the bag of groceries clutched against his chest. He didn't look back. Just kept moving, kept his head down, kept counting the steps, until he reached the boarding house. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, locked it behind him. Put the groceries on the small table. Checked the window, checked the closet, checked under the bed. Nobody. Nothing. Just him and the room and the photographs hidden under the floorboard. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. His hands were shaking. Not much, but enough to notice. You were never there. But he had been there. In that building, in those walls, in that tunnel. He'd been there, and he'd seen things, and he'd escaped, and now he was here. In this room, in this town, still waiting. Always waiting. For the next envelope. For the next photograph. For the sound of his own voice calling to him from somewhere he couldn't see. For the moment when the old man decided he was done playing whatever game this was and finally came to collect whatever debt Puckett didn't know he owed. He lay back on the bed and closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the old man's face, that smile, those eyes. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be free, that the old man was still out there, still watching, still waiting, and that one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, Puckett would find another envelope. Or he wouldn't find anything at all. He'd just hear his own voice calling to him from inside the walls, and he'd know it was time.